Okay. Hello, I am Dr. Kalinda Eaton, a professor of Africana Literature in the Clara Luper Department of African and African American Studies at the University of Oklahoma. I have the grand pleasure this afternoon of introducing our speaker, Hannibal B. Johnson. A graduate of Harvard Law School, Hannibal Johnson is an attorney, author, consultant, and college professor. He has taught at the University of Tulsa College of Law, Oklahoma State University, and the University of Oklahoma. He chairs the Education Committee for the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission and is local curator for the Commission's new history center, Greenwood Rising. Johnson is past president of Leadership Tulsa, the Metropolitan Tulsa Urban League, the Rotary Club of Tulsa, and the Northeast Oklahoma Black Lawyers Association. He is founding director of the Oklahoma Appleseed Center for Law and Justice and is past chair of the board of the Oklahoma Department of Libraries. He has also served on the Oklahoma Advisory Committee for the United States Commission on Civil Rights. He directed Anytown, Oklahoma, a statewide human relations camp for teens for more than a decade, and served on the advisory board of the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Writers Conference of the Southwest. He currently serves on the federal 400 Years of African American History Commission. Mr. Johnson is a well-known author of several books, including Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance, and Tulsa's historic Greenwood district, and Images of America, Tulsa's historic Greenwood district. His latest book project is Black Wall Street 100, An American City Grapples with Its Historical Racial Trauma. Like the famed Hannibal Barca of Tunisia eons ago, Hannibal Johnson of Tulsa is a general, ambassador, diplomat, and fierce protector of the North Tulsa community, its legacy, and its power. Please join me in welcoming Hannibal B. Johnson.
Hello.
Welcome, sir. How are
Thank
you?
you. I'm doing well. Doing well.
So let's begin. Can you tell the audience a bit about your latest book project?
So, Black Wall Street 100, An American City Grapples with Its Historical Racial Trauma, is designed to answer the question that will be on the hearts, minds, and tongues of people as they rediscover Tulsa in 2021. And that is, what is different about the Tulsa of 2021 as compared to the Tulsa of 1921, the year of that cataclysmic race massacre that occurred here in Tulsa. So the book looks at what we've done to bind the wounds of our historical racial trauma over time. And without giving away too much, obviously we haven't done enough, but we have done some things.
Thank you, Professor Simon.
Yes, Professor Johnson, could you tell us a little bit about how you came to the subject of Black Wall Street and the race massacre and Greenwood early on, and what has driven you to write these wonderful books about it, and kind of bring us up to where you are today?
You know, I knew almost nothing about Tulsa or the Black community in Tulsa or Black Wall Street, or certainly nothing about the massacre growing up. I actually grew up in Fort Smith, Arkansas, which is only about 100 miles southeast of Tulsa. I have a sort of strange and ancillary connection to Tulsa, though. My father lived in Tulsa for 1 year, his senior year in high school, and he graduated from historic Booker T. Washington High School in 1942. And so he would occasionally mention somebody from that experience living with a relative here and going to Booker T. Washington High School, but didn't really say much and never said anything about the massacre. So I came to Tulsa in the mid-1980s out of law school to work for a law firm that I clerked with during my second year of law school. I came back to work for that firm permanently. And I've always been really community-minded, fulfilled by community service. So I got involved in the community in a number of different ways. One of the things that I ended up doing was agreeing to write a guest editorial column for the Black newspaper called the Oklahoma Eagle. At one point, I was assigned to do a multi-part series on the Greenwood district. That's how I really became engaged with the community and began learning. Decided that I wanted to do something more substantive about the community and wrote the first book, Black Wall Street, From Riot to Renaissance in Tulsa's historic Greenwood district, and it was published in 1998. And at the time, there was one book out that was a book that still was a seminal book really on the massacre itself, called Death in a Promised Land by Scott Ellsworth. Scott is a professor at the University of Michigan, professor of history. He did his doctoral dissertation under the tutelage of Dr. John F. Franklin at Duke. And he turned his dissertation into the book Death in a Promised Land. It's a great book. But as I told Scott early on, I'm writing a different book. I'm not writing a book about the massacre. I'm writing a book about a community and about the people who populated the community. The massacre for me is an event that occurred in the context of community, right? I have to talk about the massacre, but I don't have to center the massacre. I center the people. That was the difference. The other difference, I think it's patently obvious. I'm a Black man, and he's a white man. And the reality is, I think that brings a different vantage to the story and to points of emphasis and nuance and all those sorts of things. It does matter who's telling the history. So we need as many people, as many voices, as many diverse voices as possible telling this history. So that's how I got initially involved. I wanted to have additional resources available for folks. So I did a book called Up from the Ashes, written on the third grade reading level, illustrated children's book. It was illustrated by my nephew, Clay Portis. Dr. Eaton is from his neck of the woods, Vallejo, California. And so he did great illustrations. And then I had the opportunity to do a book for Arcadia Publishing. Arcadia Publishing does these books all over the country called Images of America. They're pictorial narratives. So it tells the story of the community in captioned photographs, like 200 photographs. And then finally, I've got the book that just came out, Black Wall Street 100. So I've got 4 books that focus on the history of the Greenwood district.
That's wonderful. And did you meet Dr. Franklin at some point? Were you able to talk to him about his own experience as a scholar and as a resident of the community?
Yeah, I met Dr. Franklin a few times. He would come to Tulsa fairly regularly. He had a nephew, Waldo Jones, who's an attorney here in Tulsa. And, you know, he was here for the groundbreaking for the John F. Franklin Center for Reconciliation, John F. Franklin Reconciliation Park. He was honored by a group that I worked with called Oklahoma Center for Community and Justice. He was the honoree one year, so I got to have dinner with him in connection with that event. So yeah, he was definitely a presence here. And of course, he did an autobiography, Mirror to America. That was a great piece that really talked about his formative years here in Tulsa, graduating from Booker T High School as the valedictorian in 1931. There was one story that stands out to me is that there was a dinner honoring the valedictorians from the 2 high schools, the black school, Booker T, and the white school, which is now Central High School. Then it was Central then, but now it's actually Public Service of Oklahoma. It's a utility company, took over the building. But the 2 valedictorians were honored at a gala dinner at the Mayo Hotel. The white valedictorian was in the main banquet area. Dr. Franklin, the valedictorian of Booker T. Washington High School, was seated in an anteroom outside the main hall, even though he was one of the 2 people being honored that evening.
It's incredible. And he had such a distinguished career and was is really a legend for his scholarship and everything that he did overseas as well. And so just to think about that really kind of boggles the mind. Before I ask a next question, I'd like to remind our viewers to please post your questions in the Q&A function here on Zoom, and we'll get to as many of those as we can. How about could you talk a little bit about the Centennial proper and your role on the commission, maybe some of the educational initiatives that are happening around that work?
I have actually two roles connected to the 1921 Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Commission. One is chair of the Education Committee. I get to work closely with my friend Dr. Carlos Hill, who I believe is on the webinar. And the other is as local curator for Greenwood Rising, which is the world-class history center that we're building on the southeast corner of Greenwood and Archer, kind of the gateway to the Greenwood community. So in terms of the education piece, what we've been doing essentially boils down to trying to infuse this history into curricula across the state. So get it embedded in state standards, and it is there as a matter of Oklahoma history and United States history, part of what should be taught in those disciplines. We also would like to work with the Department of Education and others to see if we can't get some history questions that relate to this particular history on state mandated exams to give teachers yet another incentive to cover this history. Dr. Hill has led Summer Teacher Institute, where we bring teachers together, primarily from Tulsa Public Schools. The idea is to broaden it, but we bring teachers together, immerse them in this history, give them some degree of comfortability around this history and cultural competence around this history, such that they are able to go back and educate other teachers, educate their students, and really spread the gospel, if you will, in terms of this history. So those are the things that we're doing primarily in the educational arena. The related thing that I'm doing is serving as local curator for Greenwood Rising, the world-class history center that we're building. It's a narrative history center. In about 2 years, we raised $30 million to build this and endow it. So in the center, our patrons will experience 4 galleries. The first gallery is a Greenwood Spirit, which talks about how the community was formed, the fact that we sit on lands that were once owned by Native Americans, the fact that freedmen, Black people, people of African ancestry who were members of the 5 tribes who received land allotments, how that really buoyed the Greenwood community as a business community, who were some of the pioneers early on in the history of the community. And in this first gallery, there's a remarkable, one-of-a-kind holographic exhibit. It's a barber shop, and there are 3 barbers, holograms, who are engaging with one another and engaging with patrons and telling this history in the barbershop experience. The second gallery is Systems of Anti-Blackness, deliberately provocative. We could have said systems of oppression. We could have said domestic racism. But we wanted to be laser focused on this concept of anti-Blackness, which is a thing unto itself. So this is the gallery in which there will be information and experiences related to the massacre, but also those will be contextualized with information about, for example, Red Summer, the summer and fall of 1919, in which were over 24 so-called race riots throughout the United States in places like New York and Philadelphia, Omaha, Washington, D.C., Chicago, Elaine, Arkansas, Longview, Texas, and on and on and on. Also during this period, as a part of the contextualization, we have to talk about lynching. Lynching, not just in Oklahoma, all over the country, but certainly in Oklahoma as well. Most of us probably don't know that between statehood, Oklahoma statehood in 1907 and 1920, there were about 33 documented lynchings in Oklahoma. 27 of the 33 victims were Black. So lynching is not just something that happens in Alabama and Mississippi. It happened in Oklahoma as well after statehood. So in the next gallery, after the massacre, post-massacre, it's called Changing Fortunes. So we talk about the remarkable rebuilding of the Greenwood community after its destruction in 1921. The fact that it hosted the National Conference of the National Negro Business League in 1925, Booker T. Washington's Black Chamber of Commerce held their annual meeting here in Tulsa 4 years after the massacre. The community peaks as a business and entrepreneurial community in the early to mid 1940s. Many people learn about the history, they learn only about the massacre. They assume that the massacre is the be all and end all. It's not. The community came back dramatically and peaked again in the early to mid 1940s. Then there was a second decline beginning in the late 60s through the 70s, occasioned by integration, by urban renewal, by lack of a systematic mentorship process in place for these business owners, by changes in the economy, something I call the Walmartization of America. So what was called Black Wall Street was really much more like a Black Main Street. These were small businesses, mom and pop type operations, grocery stores, restaurants, movie theaters, pool halls, dance halls, you name it, those kinds of small businesses, and service providers, doctors, lawyers, accountants, dentists. So changes in the macro economy really harmed this kind of small town feel and entrepreneurial spirit. I tell people that even today in 2021, if I were to go out to a small all-white town in western Oklahoma and talk about bringing in a Walmart, it's likely that I would get two potential schools of thought. One is from people who are strictly consumers, they would be delighted at the presence of a Walmart. They can get lots of stuff at very competitive prices. But if I am Jane who owns Jane's Midtown hardware store, then I'm probably not going to be happy because I'm probably not going to be able to maintain my business against a Walmart. So the changes in the sort of structural economy mattered. So we'll talk about all that. And the Changing Fortunes Gallery will end with the final report of what was called the Oklahoma Commission to study the Tulsa race riot of 1921. It was a state-created commission convened in 1997, issued its final report on February 28th, 2001. It's an award-winning report. It was a fact-finding report, and it also made recommendations with regard to reparations. So that's where we close out the Changing Fortunes Gallery. The final gallery is Journey to Reconciliation. Our hope is to leverage the history of the Greenwood district and to encourage patrons to distill the lessons from that history and apply them to the present. So we want to draw a through line that connects the history of the Greenwood district with current challenges that we face today around race, whether it be Black Lives Matter, mass incarceration, police community relations, educational deficits, healthcare disparities, all those challenges that are to some extent dependent on race are things that we need to address in the present. And shouldn't there be some lessons that we have gleaned from our history in terms of how to approach those issues?
And so as we approach the Centennial next month, will the first gallery be open, or how much of the museum will be open?
We hope to have the whole thing open. Okay. It's pretty ambitious, and we're on an accelerated schedule. We have been for the last couple of months. So the opening is slated for June 2nd, which is the day after the anniversary. Again, that's really, really ambitious. So if we had, for example, a tornado that tore through the community, that would probably mean we won't be open on June 2nd as planned. But barring something like that, some act of God, we will be mostly open on June 2nd.
Wonderful. And just going back to the education component, given your involvement with the 400 Years of African History Commission, is there any kind of a national move in terms of Common Core standards, for example, to make the Tulsa and Black Wall Street, the Tulsa Massacre and Black Wall Street part of a national curriculum standard?
Yeah, so we're actually working with a firm out of New York City, and we're working on developing an educational guide that will align with basic core academic standards and align with some AP standards such that it can be used throughout the nation. So we are working to sort of be a model for other folks. And Tulsa Public Schools is developing something that I think will probably be a national model as well. They've been working with this history for quite some time now, and they're in the process of developing curriculum in grades K through 12 that incorporates this history, not just in the discipline of history, but it's a multidisciplinary approach that's multi-tiered, multi-leveled, age-appropriate curriculum.
That's wonderful. The curriculum packet that we developed in conjunction with the symposium involved fine arts and English and social studies teachers and curriculum coordinators, and mostly in Norman, but we also reached out to the Tulsa Public Schools and invited them to be involved with all of the various kind of humanities and arts approaches that we're taking this week during the symposium. So I think that's a great initiative. As you were talking about the lynching history, it occurred to me that A.J. Smitherman and Stratford and others were actually out in 1920 and early 1921 trying to prevent lynchings around the state. Is that right? That there's
That's true, and in fact, one of the more grotesque lynchings in American history happened in Oklahoma, in Okemah, the 1911 lynching of Laura Nelson and her son from a bridge. Woody Guthrie, as a boy, witnessed that lynching. His father took him to that lynching, as was common during that era.
Yeah.
So we want to look down on Mississippi and Alabama and the other places that had this sort of overt, grotesque kinds of racism, but we had it. It was here too.
Yeah. But to think about, Smitherman here, he was a newspaper editor going out to these towns and trying to prevent lynchings. That kind of heroic resistance is really impressive, for the time, to put his own life on the line, and having a family with 5 children and going out there and writing editorials and resisting lynching and all that just really is kind of phenomenal.
And of course, his reward for doing that was to be one of several dozen Black men incited for inciting this riot here in Tulsa and basically being driven out of town.
Yeah. I have a question from Dr. Hill here in the chat I'd like to pose. Your book, Black Wall Street 100, is about historical racial trauma. For you, what does it look like and feel like to face hard history? What does it mean to confront historical silences related to the race massacre?
It's tough. It's a process. I talk about acknowledgement, apology, and atonement as a sort of tripartite way to move us along the road to reconciliation. And confronting history, of course, is the acknowledgement piece, the first step, and it's really difficult. Think about how long it took us here in Tulsa to confront this history. People talk about a conspiracy of silence. So in its immediate wake, virtually nobody talked about it. There were a lot of psychological dynamics that were at play, not just in the white community, but in the Black community as well. So let's think about shame and blame and post-traumatic stress disorder and fear and passing trauma generationally. There were survivors 20 or so years ago who talked about the fact that in their families this wasn't discussed because the elders didn't want to traumatize the kids. They didn't want to burden the kids. What they could consider to be burdening the kids with this horrible reality that was their past. So we have to, all that stuff requires working through, and it doesn't happen overnight. And the acknowledgement is a process that I think unfurls. We continue to sort of move in that arena, but curriculum is part of the acknowledgement. How do we acknowledge our history in the broadest possible way? Well, we incorporate it in textbooks that are used by students in the public schools. That has a really broad reach, and that's something that we need to work on as well. I think textbooks are kind of a challenge as I see it. You may have a comment on this, but the problem as I see it is that some, if not many, textbook manufacturers are, well, first of all, they're for-profit businesses. They're often regional, they have an incentive to play to the lowest common denominator and to be non-controversial. So including this history in an affirmative way becomes a challenge, but it must be done as part of that acknowledgement piece. When I talk about apology, I'm talking about not just literal apologies, and we've had some. Our two female mayors, Susan Savage and Kathy Taylor, have both apologized on behalf of the city for the massacre. Our former police chief, Chuck Jordan, issued a public apology at John F. Franklin Reconciliation Park about 8 years ago. And he talked about the police and their dereliction of duty back in 1921 and how he was sincerely apologetic for them not protecting the people whom they were sworn to protect. That's really important. But in addition to the literal apologies, for me, developing at a broader level senses of compassion and empathy for people who have suffered, understanding that people who have suffered have particular psychological baggage that has to be addressed. And part of that baggage manifests, in my estimation, in mis or distrust Black community with respect to particularly white authority figures, right? And that's traceable all the way back to 1921. And atonement has everything to do with the word that we often bandy about, reparations. Reparations meaning to make amends or to repair damage. And you know, reparations or atonement can be at multiple levels. I think it's impossible to do too much. So we can do collective kinds of atonement or reparations. We can build facilities like John F. Franklin Reconciliation Park. We can build Greenwood Rising as a teaching institution. We can invest dollars that are targeted to Black community development and commercial enterprises. We can pay particular individuals on the individual level, cash money for people who are survivors, and there are only a handful of those, or descendants of survivors who have proof of their connections. We could do that. It seems to me that individual reparations are the most challenging to effect because they typically are sought through either the judicial process or the legislative process. The ones that I'm most familiar, the Rosewood descendants from the Rosewood Riot or Massacre in 1923 received some reparations. It was a much smaller event, and the reparations came through the legislative process. It seems to me much more difficult for reparations to come through the courts because there are institutional and structural barriers that are already in place. Statutes of limitations, resistance to opening the floodgates would be a big argument because, of course, Tulsa's not the only community that experienced historical racial trauma. There are communities all over the country that did. And it seems to me the institution that is the courts are going to automatically be on alert for opening up mass claims like that. So, you know, all sorts of challenges with respect to all sorts of different kinds of possible reparations. What we can't do is do nothing. So I think there are a number of avenues to pursue. We can pursue all of them and see where we go.
Thank you. Yeah, acknowledgement, apology, atonement. I like how you frame that arc. I have also another question from Dr. Hill about why do you think it is important to remember Greenwood as Black Wall Street 100 years after the race massacre?
Well, you know, Black Wall Street has that symbolic resonance with Black folks. So people all over the country are talking right now about Tulsa. They're talking about Black Wall Street because it's in part really aspirational. The idea that there was something Black, something that belonged to Black people, that was developed by Black people for Black people in this crucible of racism that created unspeakable obstacles for them. It is remarkable, and it's inspirational and aspirational for Black folks. So that's important. I think we need the inspiration and the aspiration. that is Black Wall Street. And we also need to continue to be cognizant of the depths to which we can sink as human beings with regard to the way that we treat one another. And we're reminded of that when we think about the massacre in 1921.
About other things that you would encourage folks to think about if they're planning a trip to Tulsa, just in terms of understanding the history? For me, it was, even moving here 20 years ago when the commission report came out, it was always kind of an abstraction, the numbers of schools and businesses and the hospital and homes and grocery stores and the library, libraries, if you just kind of catalog the losses, until you come to Tulsa, which I started doing in 2018, and you get a sense of being in Greenwood, deep Greenwood, and Vernon AME is right there. The Greenwood Cultural Center is right there. What would you recommend to folks who may have never visited Tulsa? What might they hope to experience there?
If you're specifically interested in Black Wall Street or the Greenwood District, the places that you mentioned, you want to go to the Greenwood Cultural Center, John F. Franklin Reconciliation Park, Vernon AME and Mount Zion are two historical churches. Langston University has a satellite campus in the Greenwood District, as does Oklahoma State University. There are plaques embedded in the sidewalks that really memorialize the businesses that once existed on those spots. Greenwood Rising the building is up. I mean, we're slated to open in 2 months. You can see what's been built of that building as well. We are also, as part of our work with the Centennial Commission, and there's a meeting right now that I have a conflict, I can't be there, but we're developing an app so that you download this app and you can take you can take a tour of the Greenwood community. So let's say you're standing on a particular street corner. You're using this app and you can pull up what used to be there and read about the history and actually see images of what was once where you are. So that's something that I don't know how far along we are. I think we're pretty far along. And all the scripts for the app have been developed. I think it should be ready, I hope, by the anniversary.
That's really exciting. It really struck me as I was walking through the neighborhood, the bronze plaques that are embedded in the sidewalks there, block after block after, just 100 feet apart. There's another plaque. Are there other sites of remembrance that are being planned to in the neighborhood to create memorial spaces for the Centennial?
Well, they're already at the Greenwood Cultural Center. There's a Black Wall Street Memorial. It's a memorial to the businesses that were lost. And on the campus of Oklahoma State University, there is a memorial to E.W. Woods, the legendary principal of Booker T. Washington High School, who served for more than 30 years and died in 1948. So you want to see those places as well. Again, the community changed over time because of integration and urban renewal and so forth. So I encourage people when they're in the community to think at a really deep level about integration, because generally, and I think I can only speak for myself, I perceive integration as a social good generally. But the reality is, with respect to the Greenwood District, as a business community for Black people and Black entrepreneurs, integration was a net negative because it allowed dollars to flow outside the community, and there was not a commensurate number of Black dollars flowing into the community to support the businesses and service providers that existed here. So integration is in some ways a negative factor. And what's remarkable about this community is that it was as a business community, is that it was a community of necessity. It met unmet needs, and they were unmet because they couldn't be, because of legal segregation and discrimination, those needs could not be met in the white community.
I have a question in the Q&A from a colleague here in the history department at OU, Ben Keppel. He writes, among the tragedies here is not one of these that the Tulsa Massacre was a final answer to the question of whether Oklahoma might be a place where African Americans could escape racism and purging elsewhere by coming to Oklahoma and starting something new and better for African Americans and others?
Yeah, I mean, I think part of the tragedy or travesty is just that. I mean, Oklahoma was touted, not just Tulsa, but Oklahoma generally, Oklahoma Territory was touted as kind of the promised land by people like E.P. McKay back in the 1800s. 1890, he met with President Benjamin Harrison. He had circulars and he hired individuals to literally recruit Black people to come to Oklahoma. And part of the lure was an escape from the kind of oppression that Black people faced in the Deep South. Oklahoma at statehood mirrored and mimicked that very type of oppression, and it became a highly racialized society. And so people, ironically, had gone from the frying pan to the fire almost. And, they really didn't better their condition in terms of oppression, although some people did find some opportunity here.
And of course, the legendary Huck Finn, lights out for the territory, and he's headed to Indian Territory, Oklahoma, and looking for that promised land. And so, right there, you see it embedded in American history, culture, in so many ways, as a space that is somehow exceptional, but also fundamentally most American. So it's really interesting to think about the paradoxes of that.
And so the other thing that's really interesting too is that if we look back at our history in the late 1800s, there had things gone a little bit differently. What is now Oklahoma could have been 3 states: Sequoia, the Native American state, part of it carved out to be an all-Black state called whatever, and then part of it the Oklahoma that we know today.
Indeed, yeah. So much there, so much rich opportunities for reflection in your talk today. It looks like we have another question in the Q&A. Did Oklahoma's proximity to racial violence in Texas heighten this hope? It's a follow-up question to the previous one.
That's a great question. I don't know if I know the answer to that. I don't know what effect proximity to Texas may have had on Oklahoma. Do you?
I don't know.
It's an interesting question. I'll look into that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. It looks like we're out of questions for now, but it's really, I'm really delighted to have been able to speak with you, and on behalf of the Tulsa Race Massacre Centennial Coordinating Committee with Dr. Hill and Dr. Eaton. It's really been delightful to have you be a part of our symposium this week, and congratulations on your new book. I'm really excited to come see Greenwood Rising, and hope we can see it there as not only for the Centennial, but in years to come as well. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Okay, Hannibal Johnson, thank you again, and we'll see everyone back in about an hour with Tracy K. Smith giving our keynote talk to cap off our symposium on this Friday afternoon, and we'll hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.